Okay, so general Grasshopper introduction. You guys have been working in Rhino, so you understand a little bit about it. Somebody had asked a question the first day about, if I update a line, is it going to update the surface? In Rhino, generally the answer is no, right? And that can be pretty frustrating. So, for example, if I draw a rectangle and I make a planar surface out of it, right, and go into Ghosted. If I update something about the rectangle, right, if I take that curve and turn on my control points, points on, and I change one of these points locations, it has no relationship to the surface. The surface doesn't remember how it was made or what it was made from. Rhino recognized that, right? So it started within its own program, within its own platform, to provide for some opportunity for this. So down at the bottom of your screen, you have this little tab over here beside the snaps that says Record History. If you click that and turn it bolded, and then take this outline and make a planar surface out of it, if I can spell. Now, if you can see that it turned itself off, right? It unbolded itself. It stays on for one command until you tell it otherwise. If I take that curve again and turn on the control points and move one of the points of the curve, the surface is going to update with it, right? So you can see that, for example, in slightly more complicated things like lofts. So let me make a couple of lines. And I'm going to rotate them in 3D. Right now they're flat. I'm going to rotate 3D. And rotate them up so they start having some dimension to them. If I loft across these, so if I select all three of them and type in loft, right, it's going to loft my surface, but it's not going to care what happens to my curves afterwards, right? So if I turn the points on and move a point, the curve is going to update, but the surface is not. If I do the same thing with Record History on, type in loft, select the curves in sequence, hit enter, hit OK, and I change something about the curve now, it's going to update the surface automatically, right? So it'll only record the history for one command at a time unless you tell it to always record the history. Basically, don't worry about record history. We're not going to be using that. It's just demonstrating that Rhino started out with recording the history, and then it realized that starts to become really cumbersome. So if I were to make a copy of this surface, the nice thing about it is if I were to make a copy of this surface, and I update something about one of these curves. I have to have record history on, so I can start kind of cascading this. So if I copy now with record history on, and I update something about one of the curves, both of the surfaces are going to update, right? So it starts to record multiple types of history. But if I accidentally copy this guy over without record history on, or at a certain point it starts to break the recording, and you don't necessarily have any way of tracking what happened first and what's connected to what, and it can start to get really messy and really complicated. So the answer to that, the way to use Rhino parametrically meaning a set of fixed relationships with variable values, right? So a square is always the same set of relationships, but the size of the square can change, right? So there's a fixed definition of what a square is, but the size can change. And so that happens on many different levels in terms of parametric design in Rhino. So the kind of parametric component of this is a plugin called Grasshopper. So Grasshopper, you guys all know how to start up Grasshopper. Just type in Grasshopper in the command line. It'll open this secondary window. background, you know a little bit about how it works, right? There's a canvas, and on it, I guess you guys haven't really made anything on it. You're just using one that you were given, so we'll talk about that in a second. But they're related to each other, right? So the plugin of Grasshopper works side by side with Rhino. So if I wanted to make the same thing happen using Grasshopper that I just did with the record history, I need to represent what I want to happen. I'm basically making a diagram of what I want to happen in Grasshopper, right? So what are the things that we need to make a loft? What are the elements that we need? Curves, okay. And then what? We need to tell it we want to loft the curves together, right? So we need both of those things. So there's a series of elements, which are called components, and a series of actions that are called, I just completely forgot the term. I'll think of it in a second, as soon as I stop trying. Components and parameters and components. Sorry. So the parameters are the elements, and the components are the things that do things, right? So parameters contain information. So a curve would be a parameter, and then components are things that do things. So lofting or an action would be a component, right? Does that make sense? So in here there are a series of tabs that have elements in it that you can pull from here. So in the same way that Rhino has a couple of different ways to access commands, Grasshopper does too. It has either drop-down menus that allow for you to pull things from them, or it has this series of visual elements that you can grab and drag, or it has a command line, but it doesn't have a fixed one. If you double-click in the canvas, it'll pop up a command line, a floating command line, so you can type into that something that you want to happen. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in a curve parameter. So I'm going to type in curve. And you can see that a bunch of different types of curves pop up the same way as in Rhino. You get the list of different commands. I want the black one. I want the one that is a parameter. These other ones have different curve elements to them, but I want the one that just contains a collection of generic curves, right? And you can see that it drops this little orange thing onto your canvas. For sake of visual or clear visualization, I'm going to make 3 different curve parameters because I have 3 different curves in Rhino that I want to loft together. So I'm just going to copy, Control-C, Control-V 2 times and make 3 different curves lined up together. Everybody with me so far? Yep. Okay, so beside that I need a loft. So if I just start typing in loft, I can grab this loft component. And you can start to see that they have kind of input and output little diodes on them. Basically, a parameter doesn't ask for any information, it just contains information, but when you get to a component, they'll have these black labels in the middle that tell you what they are, and they'll be asking for information as an input, and they'll be giving you information as an output, right? So if you think of the action of lofting, it's taking in curves, it's taking in loft options, which tell it whether you want it to be straight sections or normal loft or loose, or those different options that come up when you loft something in Rhino, and then it gives you a lofted surface as the result. So what we're going to do is plug these curves into the C. So if you hover over the letters, right, they're just there to give you a clue as what they are, but if you hover over them, it'll tell you specifically what it's asking for. So it's asking for section curves. If I try to plug each one of them in individually, it unplugs the previous one. So like everything in Rhino, if you hold down Shift, you can add to the selection.
You got the loft the same way you got the curve?
Yep, double click, type in loft,
And then which one?
and then hit enter.
Okay, sure.
Yep. What's that? Yep. You double click, and then it starts typing, and then you can start typing. No worries. Okay, so everybody have 3 curves and a loft, or I'll give you a minute to do that.
Do you need to hold the shift down to put all 3 in the same?
Yes. And just in Rhino, while you're doing that, I want to show you, I just want to indicate to you, so when I'm lofting something in Rhino, this is not in Grasshopper, this is in Rhino, it comes up with this loft options panel, and it asks you a series of questions, right? What type of loft you want to make it, whether you want it to be closed or open, whether you want it rebuilt or not. So that's what this O is in the loft command. It's asking you about loft options. So if you want to do anything special to your loft, there is a loft options component that has the same series of elements to it on the left-hand side, and then you would plug this into the options. So if I want it to be a closed loft, I need to tell it that I want it to be closed. And there isn't a checkbox in here, so what it does is work in Boolean. So we're basically scripting. We're basically writing a computer program with visual representations of the commands, right? So if you've ever taken any sort of computer programming class, or even if you haven't, you understand that it's basically a series of logical steps. So we need to tell it, if we hover over it now, for example, if we wanted it to be a closed loft, meaning that it wrapped back around to the beginning rather than starting at the beginning and going to the end, right now it's telling us false. So it's dealing in Booleans. It wants to know whether it's on or off, true or false. And so there's a Boolean toggle, right? So Boolean, everybody remembers, we've been Booleaning volumes, right? So taking things out. And remember, it's a series of like a Venn diagram, so things that are overlapping or things that are intersecting. So we can tell it that we want it to be either true or false. So you can double click on it, it'll change it back and forth between true and false. You don't really need to worry about this, but just trying to explain what all of the different things are. Okay, so right now it's not doing anything. It's orange, which means it doesn't have any information. It means that we need to tell it something. We don't know what curves to loft, right? They're connected to each other, but only after we kind of key things together. So the way that you connect Grasshopper elements to Rhino geometries is by right-clicking on the element, right-clicking on the parameter, and in the list of different things that come up, it's going to ask you to set a geometry. So in this case, it's asking me to set one curve. So I'm going to click on that. It's going to bring me directly into Rhino, and I'm going to pick my first curve. And you can see now that it's green. Or when I select it, it's green. When I don't select it, it's light gray. Everybody doing okay? You've got your parameters and components plugged together? I'm sorry?
Can you select, like if you have each room as a layer, you can select the layer, or do you have to select it on the Rhino?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Can you select it from the layer menu, or do you have to select it from the perspective view?
If I want to set a curve, can I go over here and select objects? Is that what you mean? Yeah, you can, but you'll be selecting everything that's on that layer. We just want one curve at the moment. Okay, so I'm selecting the second curve. I right-clicked on it and clicked on the second curve. And you can see now that I've got a red surface that's lofting across these two curves. If I add the next curve to it, it's going to continue that loft across. All right. And I had it close the loft, so let me just, sections. Oh, I plugged them in a different order. Okay, so do you see that it's lofting from the middle to the outside to the front? It matters what order you plug them in, the same way as when you're making a loft in Rhino, it matters what order you select them. So I need to make sure I've plugged the first one in first, the second one in second, and the third one in third.
How do you delete those connections?
You either just drag a new connection on top of it, or if you hold down Control the same way as you deselect something, see it turns into a red arrow, the little cursor, that'll deselect something. So like Shift makes it a green arrow and adds to it, and Control subtracts from it. Did everybody get that to work? No? What are you having problems with? Do you have the components on the screen? Do you have curve, 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 and loft?
Yes.
Do they look like this?
Yes.
Okay. Hold down Shift, connect the first one, the second one, and the third one. And then right-click on the first parameter, set one curve, and it'll take you into Rhino, and you need to click on your first curve. Set one curve on the second, click on your second curve, and then set one curve on the third, and click on your third. curve in the beginning. You can just make straight lines for now, just to see how it works. So you can make 3 straight lines. You get it, Jeremy? So most importantly, do you understand kind of the logic behind that? Did you guys in the back okay? I see some, yes? You're okay, okay. So if you start to click on the elements in Grasshopper, you'll see them highlight in Rhino, so it gives you a visual cue as to what is connected to what. So you can see the lines turn green, or you see the surface turn green. Right now, if I try to go into Rhino and click on something that didn't start out in Rhino, like the lofted surface, I can't select it. It's not really a real geometry yet. It's still a Grasshopper geometry. The reason is that, imagine that there's other things that I want to do to this before I finish with the geometry, right? So say I wanted to perforate this and I wanted to divide it up and do a bunch of different things. If it turned every step into a new geometry, you would have all of these different elements on top of each other. So it basically keeps everything in Grasshopper until you tell it to export something back to Rhino. Does that make sense? So everything exists in Grasshopper until you export something out of it. And the process for that is called baking. So if I wanted to bake this surface into Rhino, I would select the loft, right-click on it, and choose the little bake here that has a scrambled egg or a fried egg beside it. And then you can tell it what layer you want to bake it onto in Rhino. So say I want to bake it on layer 1, hit OK, and now I've got a Rhino surface that came out of Grasshopper. Does that make sense? Jeremy, you okay? Yeah. You're good? Cool. All right. Awesome. So the thing to understand with Grasshopper is that it does everything Rhino does, but you need to know how things are working in Rhino, and you need to know how shapes are made to be able to control it in an understandable way. Like right now you're working with kind of a black box. Somebody gave you a script, and you're changing numbers, and it's giving you something happening over here on the output, but you don't really understand what's happening on the inside. I think it's important, it's good to be able to have that. It's good to be able to take something complicated and understand how it works. But generally, I think it's good to start with really simple things and then build up more complexity to it, right? So, what would be another really simple thing in Rhino that we would want to try to do in Grasshopper? Just so that we can kind of think through the process of it. What's something simple? Make a box?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so how do we make a box in Rhino by itself? You click on the box. We have a series of options for how to make it, right? Or we can extrude a plane or a curve if you want to do it that way. So we could either start out with, anything, right? So let's think a little bit about how this works, right? So what is a box? What does it start out as? Or what are the things that we need to know about the box? What's really making up a box?
6 lanes.
6 planes, and what's making up a plane?
4 lines.
4 lines, and what's making up a line?
Dots.
2 points, right? So if we start to deconstruct the box, we go from 6 planes to 4 lines per plane to 2 points per line, right? So we could start with a point, we could start with a line, we could start with a surface and make the box from that. It depends on how many steps we go back, right? So let's start with, we'll start in Rhino just for sake of ease. We'll start with a surface. And we can go through the more complicated, or you guys can think a little bit about the more complicated ones yourselves. So we would want to represent that surface in Grasshopper. So I'm going to double click to open my command line and type in plane.
How do you clear your past program?
What do you mean, sorry?
I wanted to get rid of the curve thing.
You want to get rid of all of this?
Yeah.
Just delete it. Control X or delete.
Press and delete. Control.
Try Control X. Oh, you're on Mac. Yeah, you have to do Control X. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to double click and type in plane, and I want the plane that's a parameter, right? The one that has the black hexagon. And you could, like I don't want to make it even more complicated, but there's a lot of different types of things that can contain a plane. There's other things called B-reps, which are boundary representations, which just contain generic geometries. It doesn't care if it's a point or a line or a plane or a volume. But for now, we're going to be specific, and we're going to right-click and set one plane. I'm sorry, this is going to be wrong. We don't want to use this one. I'm sorry. We want three-dimensional axis systems. We're just going to use a B-rep. So this guy here, right-click, set one B-rep, and it's setting our plane. So it's taking a boundary representation of the geometry, and that's going to be good for us. And from that, we want to extrude.
So we're setting one V-rep on our plane.
Yeah, we want to take the plane and tell that in Grasshopper that's what we want in this parameter.
Okay.
And this is just a random plane, just to...
Yeah, just something that you're drawing. And then from there, you can think about how you want to make the extrusion of that, right? So we're going to basically take going to take that surface and extrude it along a vector, right? So we're going to take that and extrude it up. So under surface and freeform, you can find this extrude component, or you can double click and type in extrude, and you'll see it here as well. If you hover over these, they'll describe kind of what they mean. So extrude linear, extrude along a curve or along a vector. So these guys do pretty much the same thing, but this one's going to do it in a straight line, and this one will let you choose whatever line you want. So I'm just going to click the generic extrude. And then it's asking you for a profile or a surface curve. So that's what we're going to plug our B-rep into. And it's asking you for a direction. So what direction are we extruding this curve? Vertically? What axis is that? Z, right? So we need to tell it that we want it to extrude in the Z direction. So there are parameters for Z axes, for all the different axes. So if we go under vectors, so going back, our math teacher is going to be invaluable in this process, right? We're going back to kind of algebra and geometry and understanding all of these things. So vectors, we have a unit Z vector, right? Or you can double click and type in Z, and you'll have a unit Z here. So it's under the tab called vectors, and then it's under vector. Or you can double click and type in Z, and it will bring up unit Z.
And is that tied to that plane?
Not yet. It's not connected to anything yet. Right? So if we plug this into the direction, which is what D is asking us for, and we zoom over here, you can see that we're extruding, but we're only extruding a really little bit, right? So the base unit is 1. The default is 1. So we need to tell it that we want it to extrude more than 1, right? So how are we going to do that? What's that? Use a number. What kind of number? We're just going to say like 6, and it's going to know 6 in...
I'm looking for a slider.
Yes, we will put a slider in, but how? So we need to take the 1 and multiply it by a number, right? So we need to put a multiplication factor in here. So multiply, and we're going to add that in between the vector and the direction of the vector, right? So we're going to take the V, I'm sorry, what? Where's the vector at? Double click, type in Z, unit Z. Yep, under vectors, it's under vector, vector, unit Z. Okay.
And then what's the AB that you got?
So that's multiply, so double click and type in multiply or multiplication, and it's this one with an X in it. Okay, so we're going to plug our vector into A, it's what we want to multiply, and then we're going to plug, we could either plug in a number, right? I could take one of these panels that basically just contain generic information, type in 2, and plug that into B. And now our surface, I don't know if you saw it, but our surface is extruding twice as much. If I type in 20, you can see a bigger difference. The number box is, it's under parameters. It's called a panel. If you double click and type in panel, it's this one that looks kind of like a Post-it note with a squiggle on it. and you basically just double click and you can type anything into it. So you use panels to make notes to yourself or to see what information is coming out of something.
Yeah, I double clicked it and I got a text box.
A panel? Yep. So you want to plug that into B, type a number into it, hit OK, and then your resultant of that multiplication is what you want to plug into D now. You want to unplug the vector directly or just plug the R into D, right? And that's now extruding it 20 units in the Z direction. But we don't want to have to constantly go in and type in a new number, right?
What if it didn't extrude?
It means that your R is not plugged into the D. So Angela was having a problem with in here. She had typed in a number and then hit enter and hit OK, and all of a sudden my component turns red. It means danger, danger. You have to be careful about spaces and returns. Everything means something in programming language, so you want it to just be the number and then hit OK, and that'll fix it for you. Yeah. So just the number, no spaces, no returns, no punctuation, anything. Okay, so did everybody get that far? Everybody have an extruded box that's some number of units high? Okay, so as Mr. Briggs mentioned, we want to be able to control this with more variation, right? We don't want to just have to type in a number or type in a new number. We want to be able to choose a number within a range of numbers, right? So another basic thing that you'll be using all the time is called a number slider. So in the parameters, it's this guy that has an arrow pointing down to a scale, or you can type in slider. It's the number slider. Or very fancily in the new Grasshopper, you can just type in a number, and it'll give you a slider set to that number. So let's say we picked up the slider, just the general slider. So slider, number slider. It's going to give us some random number to start with. We don't necessarily want to extrude 0.25, and we don't necessarily want to extrude between 0 and 1. So if you double click where it says slider on the left-hand side, it's going to bring up the slider dialog box. And it gives you a series of options here. So R is a floating point number, which means a number with a decimal after it. N is an integer, so it means whole numbers. E is even numbers, and O is odd numbers. So you can choose what kind of range of numbers you're working with. Usually you're going to be working with integers or whole numbers. And then below that is the domain. So it's going to be a little bit frustrating at first, but everything in Grasshopper starts counting at 0, not at 1, right? So if I have a square, it has a series of points. Right? So if I have a square, it's made by a series of points at the corners, and those are 0, 1, 2, and 3, not 1, 2, 3, and 4. So just know that up front. So it's going to start counting at 0, and it's going to go up to whatever you tell it to. So you can click and set the range to 100 and hit the little green check, or you can grab on one of these dials and move it up or down. And then at the bottom is what number the slider is currently set to. So you could preset it to some specific number or double click and type in the number. So if I want it set to 25, I could hit OK. And now I have a slider that goes from 0 to 100, and I can choose which number in between I want to set it to. So now we're going to plug that into B, and you can watch your box get bigger or smaller, right? Depending on what the number is in the range that you set it to. What's that? I can't hear you if you're asking a question, sorry. And so just remember that at any point, you have a bunch of different things happening in here. So, depending on if we make this more and more complicated, we're going to have, our extrusion, and then maybe we scale it, and maybe we break it up into a series of planes and perforate the planes or do a number of things. So you can have things be showing or not showing. So right now we have our original Rhino plane that's showing up in Rhino. We have our B-rep that's showing up on top of that. Then we have our extrusion. So if we wanted to hide the B-rep, you can right-click on it and hit preview, and it'll make it not show up, and I can hide this. And so now I'm just seeing the extrusion. So the colors, orange means it's asking for information, red means there's an error, light gray means everything's working great, slightly darker gray means it's unpreviewed, and if it's all grayed out, it means it's not enabled. So I can disable it, meaning that I'm taking it out of the queue, right? That everything is going to stop working from that point on. So if I right-click on and select enabled, it means that I'm turning that component off, and everything that's happening from that point on is going to stop working. So those are what the colors are for. Up here in your Grasshopper window, a couple other things to know. See these little cylinders, these little tubes? The first one means that you're not showing anything. The second one means that you're showing things in wireframe. And the third one means that you're showing it rendered. So if I switch over here, you can see that if I click on this one, nothing is showing in Rhino. The next one shows it in wireframe. And the third one shows it in kind of ghosted. The next one over only draws the preview for things that are selected. So if I select my extrusion, or if I unpreview this, I can select my B-rep, and it'll show me just the thing that I have selected. And that's pretty much all of the settings that you use. I would say typically don't use this one; it just gets a little bit confusing. You can also go into the preview settings and change the colors around, but I wouldn't really do any of that. So does everybody kind of understand what we did? We understand that we took a plane and extruded it, and we allowed for it to be extruded a different distance, right? Does everybody understand that? So if we were to go back, we could, instead of starting with a plane in Rhino, we could have started with a point that we then moved over a certain distance and made into a line. And we could have taken that line and extruded it into a plane, and then plugged that plane into the extrusion and made it into a volume, right? So we could go back further and further until we get to just, it's all just ones and zeros. Okay. Anything else you want to... Is everybody kind of getting the sense of how Rhino, or Grasshopper works in relation to Rhino? Anything else you want to try really quickly before we move on to the project-specific stuff?
You just go to the toggles on the lock options. Do you need to open a toggle for each of those, or do you just...
The loft options? Yeah, so if you hover over them, you can see in the little box that down there it says one locally defined value is false. So that's a way to know that that is either set to true or false, right? So you would need to put in a Boolean toggle that would plug into that, and that will allow you to change it from true to false. So now if I hover over it, it's one value is true. This one is asking you for a Boolean as well, so whether you adjust the seams or not. This one is asking you for a number, so do you want to rebuild it? And if so, how many points do you want to rebuild it at? So they're all asking for different things. This one's also asking you for a number. Do you want to refit the tolerance of it? And then the last one is asking if you have a particular type of loft that you want it to be. So it's going to default to normal, but you could put in a number that allows for it to be either loose, tight, straight, developable, or uniform. So you would need to plug something different into each of those, although you could plug the same Boolean toggle into the ones that are asking for Booleans if you want them all set to the same thing. Does that make sense? Any other questions before we move on? You can have multiple Grasshopper programs open at the same time, multiple Grasshopper scripts, they're called, or definitions is what you're defining a series of sequences. You can also, the nice thing about it is that once you design a Grasshopper script or design a Grasshopper definition, you can save it. It's not specific to any one geometry until you tell it which geometry to be specific to. So if I were to, for example, make a circular surface, I can use the same definition to extrude a circular surface, right? So once you've made a sequence of events or a series of relationships, you can save it and apply it to any number of projects or any number of definitions in the future that need to do the same thing, right? So if I wanted to make an extrusion in another project, I could go in and copy this and paste it in and connect it to some other things. So you start building up a library of different actions. And you can also, there's also a huge Grasshopper community online, and you can go onto the Grasshopper forum, which is grasshopper3d.com, and then discussions. And people post definitions all the time. You can go in and find different things and play around with them and apply them to your projects. And there's all sorts of tutorials online as well. If you're looking for something specific and you want somebody to help you figure out how to do it. Okay?
That's amazing.
It's pretty cool, right?
I mean, that's the world. I mean, it makes everybody a programmer in a simple way.
Yep. But it's really powerful, but it requires you to really understand what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just kind of clicking and dragging and, what's that? It's not going to work? Yeah, it's not going to work well, right? You might be able to get something out of it, but if you don't understand what's happening step by step along the way, it's going to be a mess getting there. And you're not going to really understand when you have a problem, you're not going to understand how to solve it. Because you can imagine these scripts are going to get more and more complicated. And if all of a sudden something turns red and you have no clue what you've been doing, it's going to be a mess. The other thing, just while I'm thinking about it, so if you go on to grasshopper3d.com, this discussions is where the forum is. So you can go on to here, and these are just all the most recent posts, but if, for example, you have a problem with extrusions, you can search for a word, and you'll see all of the different posts that people have had, or people have posted that relate to that topic. And you can see if people have replied to it. So this person is having problems extruding a 3D lofted plane. And they'll post what their definition looks like, and somebody will reply to them, and maybe they'll try to help them out, and so on and so forth. And you can see here that they've attached the Grasshopper script so that somebody can download it and look at it. These look different. They're using a different preview option in Grasshopper that just shows a little icon instead of the black bar. So it's the same thing, right? This is still the same loft component. And this is extruding it in the Y direction rather than the Z direction. And this is your B-rep for a plane. The last thing is you can go under tutorials, and there's some really good tutorials in here, some video tutorials that might help you. There is this one down here. So David Rutan is the person that writes Grasshopper. He's the programmer that designs it. And he has made a great kind of introduction video to a webinar, to Rhino. One caveat is that he has a pretty severe stutter, and so sometimes it's hard to kind of follow along a little bit, but he's the kind of programming genius behind it. So it's a good one to watch. And this other thing here, this Grasshopper primer, is a free download. It's a free PDF. It's like 200 pages long, and it's basically a user's manual to Grasshopper. So you can go in and it describes component by component what they are, how they work, data trees, all sorts of different types of things. And then this last one over here, I don't know how to pronounce this name, but this is a graduate from the Emerging Technologies group at the AA in London, and there's all sorts of different really cool, interesting things that they've developed that you can download tutorials for. So this is a really good site for questions as well as new types of things to see what people are doing. Okay, speaking of sites, on our site under tutorials, under video tutorials, I put a series of Grasshopper video tutorials in here. If you download them, they have a video as well as the Grasshopper and Rhino files, so you can open the Grasshopper and Rhino files and follow along with them. That's why they're zip files, so they have a bunch of stuff in them. So you can go through at your leisure and play around with a couple of different tutorials that I've made. Okay, so let's get more specifically into your projects. So I have my stretched volumes. And I have my my file from Dan. Right. I have my enclosure file, which I'm going to open. Right. So in here, somebody has made for you this fantastically complex script that takes your boxes, makes points at the corners, connects all the points, finds the outside ones, connects them all into lines, and gives you at the end of the day a series of lines that you can bake into Rhino and Loft, right? So I'm going to, in Rhino, hide this guy, turn on these. So I've got my boxes, and now through Grasshopper I've made my lines, which end up over here in the call pattern. Did everybody's been able to do that? You've been able to plug in your boxes and get the lines? Have you tried to do that yet?
Yeah.
Jenny? No? Yes? No? What are you having problems with?
I was through my desktop and running it on my laptop recording, so I haven't done it.
Okay. So if you have problems, let me know. So what you're going to do, ideally we would go through in Grasshopper and turn those lines into surfaces and use those directly to perforate. It's not set up to do that, and for me to tell you how to do it, it's going to be really complicated, so I think it's easiest just to do a little manual labor and go into Rhino and loft the curves together, which is what the intention of this was. So to do that, you bake your cull, which is the last parameter in the definition, into Rhino. And you want to make sure that you're doing it on the right layer, right? So in Rhino, I have set up a boxes layer, outlines layer, and tell me if this is different than what you've been told. I didn't get the whole thing, I just got the scripts. So did it go beyond that? Do you have specific instructions for what to do next?
Just the surf point to...
The surfaces to make the planes, and then that's where and then you join them, and then you've been perforating them, or have you gotten to that point yet?
We haven't got there.
You haven't gotten it yet? Okay.
Oh, and you did mention you were going to teach us how to unfold it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So in Rhino, set up layers for... What's that? So in Rhino, set up layers for your boxes, for your outlines, for your planes, perforations, text, score, cut, and dashed. If you haven't done so already, those are going to be the layers that we're going to reference in this sample file. So I would bake my lines onto my outlines layer, right? What? Can I what? Pull the list back up. So boxes, outlines, planes, perforations, text, score, cut, and dashed. I'm actually going to add a second text layer, so I'm going to call this text outlines. And once you have your outlines in Grasshopper, you want to bake them into Rhino onto the outlines layer. I'm going to turn off my boxes, and I'm going to hide my Grasshopper geometry so that I don't have those little dot indicators in the lines showing up.